We're kicking off this afternoon with our second keynote speech. Our speaker is Dr. Kaytee Canfield, who is a social scientist at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency's Office of Research and Development in the Office of Science Advisor, Policy, and Engagement. They're a qualitative social scientist by training and lead translational science efforts to improve partner-engaged environmental and public health research approaches, communication, and engagement. Dr. Canfield has a BS and MA in environmental studies from the University of Southern California and a PhD in marine affairs from the University of Rhode Island, where their dissertation research focused on the environmental and social justice of tourism development on Catalina Island, California. In the past, her work has focused on inclusive science communication, engagement in water quality research, and justice in tourism development. And we're really excited to have you here. The floor is yours.
Great. Thank you so much for the introduction, Sarah. I'm sorry, y'all, if I end up looking up to the corner. I have a new setup in the room. So I promise I am looking at my slides. I just haven't got the webcam in the best position. As Sarah noted, I'm Kaytee and I'm a social scientist. So a little bit of a different angle from more of the microplastics and other specific contaminants conversations. Today, I'm going to be talking a bit more holistically about my work around the science of science communication and doing this thing that I'm calling today impact-driven science so that we can move beyond science for science's sake. Well, see, look at that, already struggling. So just as an overview of where we're going to go for the next 45 minutes, I'm going to explain a little bit about why we should bother doing the impact-driven science, and then present two different approaches that I think implement this idea of research beyond research's sake very well, which would be inclusive science communication and translational science and research, which are really the two areas that I've spent the most of my time as a researcher. So to start, as I was beginning this presentation, I was thinking, well, why do we do scientific research? And these were just some ideas I came up with. If you have some of your own, I'd be happy to hear if I totally missed something. But some of the things I thought about going from my kindergarten science classes to where I am today with my colleagues. We do science to make discoveries, solve problems, ensure we're making evidence-backed decisions. At the EPA, our motto is to protect human health and the environment. So that's why we do our science. To understand the difference between theory and then what it looks like in practice, and then also to make our science more accessible, to explain it more accessibly. That's largely where I often sit. So what are the different kinds of ways that we can do research to have an impact? What am I talking about here? So I want to start by making really clear that all kinds of research can have an impact beyond just the journal articles that we write, which absolutely are impactful among our peers, but can also be outside of our disciplinary focuses. So all of these approaches are necessary for science to address the complex problems of emerging contaminants and other environmental challenges. There are many ways that we can make an impact within our discipline, within an ecosystem, and within a community. Basic lab research can make a really big impact in advancing science and making those discoveries. Applied research, it helps us to test discoveries and their usefulness beyond the lab applications. And then interdisciplinary research helps us bring together the multiple forms of academic expertise, bringing the social and the biophysical together, or even multiple biophysical forms of science together, and to help us evaluate for a more holistic impact. And in my experience, this is really just that biophysical and social science collaboration that can be really exciting. And then finally, where I'm going to focus most of my conversation today is on transdisciplinary collaborations and research. And this kind of research is very solutions driven, where many different kinds of expertise, academic, lived experience, indigenous knowledge, work together to help serve an end user or an end community. In the healthcare setting, this can mean working closely with patients to get feedback on treatments. And in the environmental field, this could look like place-based projects to address a specific community's climate change concerns. These transdisciplinary projects require all of those aforementioned pieces as well, coming together, but also that added aspect of integrating beyond the academy and beyond just our Western definitions of scientific research. Really, this just is a focus on working with partners. And when it comes to working with partners in an impact-driven approach to science, there are a lot of ways that we can do this as well. There's not just one form of partner-engaged research. And I really like pulling together resources from a few other scholars in this space to kind of show the different realm and spectrum of roles partners can play to have high quality participation in engaged research. So it ranges based on how much influence the partner wants to or functionally has over a decision or a process, and then also as a function of how much effort the partner wants to put into the process. These different roles allow for meaningful involvement across different levels of effort, varied expertise, and priorities with respect to a collaborative project. And they are all focused on that high quality participation and meeting the goals of a community and the various partners and stakeholders involved. Prioritizing stakeholder engagement does not compromise the science, but rather emphasizes producing more equitable, usable results that better consider the needs of our communities that have been potentially marginalized in the past in scientific efforts. So adopting these different examples from past research and kind of adding my own, at the informative scale, this is where we're doing more of sharing the results of academic research with a community that may be impacted by a topic and sharing those findings with them. The next level of effort and involvement would be a consultative project or a project where the partners are a consultant, where communities ask professional researchers to conduct research on a specific topic and report the results back to them. A collaborative project here is one where you're working more together as a joint team, where the research is generally designed by the scientists and the members of the public can help participate in data collection or contributing data themselves and may help refine the research approach and sharing of results. And then co-creation is another level, and this is where they're really working together to define the entire process and are really integrated members of the research team throughout all aspects of the research. And then finally, co-leading is where we pass the expertise baton to our partners outside of Western science and not quote unquote non-credentialed by the academy. Individuals conduct research independently, and that's really passing it over to them and recognizing their expertise as leading the conversation. Along with these varied methods of partnership, there's a lot of different roles we can all play and embody in these impact-driven approaches to science. So in my past work looking at inclusive science communication, I would ask people, do you consider yourself a researcher or a practitioner? And I realized very quickly that no one who was in that space really felt that they were one or the other. And it became clear that there was this spectrum. And so that's where this was developed from, where you have your pure researcher who really likes to ask questions and make discoveries in the lab and stay in that space and do the valuable work there. And then kind of blending with those different approaches to impact-driven science I was talking about before. You can have the applied researcher, a science communication researcher who still is really focused on the theory and maybe not as much on the praxis or the practice. Then towards the middle here, we have our practitioner researcher, science communicator who's really focused on the engagement itself and the practice of sharing results. And then a pure practitioner, which is often where our partners may sit in these projects. They're all necessary parts of the process. And personally, I find myself kind of between this green and yellow towards the middle of the spectrum as a science communication researcher or a practitioner researcher when I characterize my own role in these kinds of projects. So now that we've gotten a little into the weeds of why bother doing what these different pieces of this work are, I'll wrap up this kind of heady section talking about the benefits of thinking about studying how we do science. So first of all, it can help us gain a more holistic understanding of the scientific problem beyond just the discovery itself. It helps us produce outcomes that are more useful and usable by ourselves and others, makes our results more accessible to the communities. It gives people more agency in implementing solutions. It allows us to more effectively integrate expertise. And then it also helps us from many disciplines, but then also integrating expertise from lived experience and traditional knowledge. So what does this look like in practice? As promised, I'll start grounding this a bit more, looking at implementing an impact-driven approach first through inclusive science communication. So inclusive science communication, as I'm defining it, is what you see here on the screen. It's very broad, and it's any effort to engage with people in science, technology, engineering, math, and medicine that is grounded in inclusion, equity, and intersectionality. And so this is intentionally a very big tent. And we think of inclusive science communication as a movement. And that's partially because inclusive science communication seeks to change science communication from this very unidirectional communication that comes from the expert and then is disseminated out to a public, and instead move to this more democratic approach where all these different kinds of expertise can be jointly recognized, and it's a more asset-based approach of recognizing all of the experts involved in this multi-directional conversation. And in recognizing these varied forms of expertise and taking a more democratic approach, we also need to find the meaning behind this phrase that we hear so often of, we need to meet our partners where they are. So what does this mean? This means looking at how people take in and process new information. And this is based, so the way people take in new facts is based on their experience of the world, their different beliefs, their identities, their culture, their bias, their values, the history of themselves, their families, and their cultures, and the overlap here of how people adopt this information or this lens through which they see the world. We refer to as their mental model, not just in inclusive science communication, but more wholly in social science and science of science communication. And this is how people make sense of scientific information. And it is essential to understand this background and the way people will assimilate new information in order to communicate more inclusively. So this plays into the three key tenets that we've identified, or three key traits rather, of inclusive science communication. And these were developed based on interviews I did with early leaders of the inclusive science communication movement from primarily the US and Canada, but also a few from Europe. And so these were the key traits that came up across all of the 30 conversations I had with these leaders of what makes their practice inclusive and what they embody in all of their efforts to really lead an inclusive science communication approach. So all grounded in equity again. The primary trait here is intentionality. So this is intentionally considering your audience, their definitions of science, and how marginalized identities are or have been represented and supported in science communication. So this is really the embodiment of that mental model piece. Next is reciprocity. So looking back at those different models of partnership, this is looking at how you can address past and present inequities through creating truly equal and equitable partnerships that recognize and value the different forms of expertise to make sure that everyone involved has a benefit from the experience. And then finally, and very importantly, is reflexivity, where we continually reflect, on our own identities, our practices and outcomes, as well as those of our organizations and systems in which we operate, and adapt our approaches and representation as needed to better address inequitable interactions that have existed in the past or that are being perpetuated currently. So these three key traits together are the foundation of that inclusive approach to science communication. Some additional core tenets that we like to point to as key to an inclusive approach to science communication are that inclusive science communication recognizes history and centers marginalized perspectives in STEM dialogue, where that second M stands for medicine. It acknowledges intersectionality and its effects, so all the ways our different identities that we have coexist and the way that impacts us. It recognizes that biases, experiences of science, recognizes that biases and experiences of science communicators affect their work. It celebrates assets over perceived deficits, so recognizing those varied forms of knowledge we all bring to the table, and aims to cultivate belonging and engagement of all perspectives, not just the unidirectional quote unquote expert or communicator to a public. And then also that inclusive science communication can help us shift organizational cultures and structures to help redress the systemic problems of access and engagement with STEM. So moving into what does this look like in practice? I'm not going to talk through every aspect of this beautiful rainbow here, but this is one example of how this idea and movement of inclusive science communication has been put into practice. This is not my work, but a really wonderful example from Caldwell et al. That came out a couple of years ago, looking at taking those three key traits and applying them to predominantly white academic institutions and providing us with the different questions we can ask of ourselves at these different scales at which we operate to ensure we're embodying all of those key traits. And that really segues into the first recommendation of how to put this into practice, which is to embed those key traits in all science communication practice. And then I would also say in our research as much as possible as well, in defining our questions and our outputs and who we are working to support with our impact driven science. This is the starting point of practicing an inclusive approach to science communication, but not the end. And also importantly, so often our approaches, our efforts at diversity, equity, and inclusion can end up being a side project, but we want to emphasize that this adding these three key traits to your project should be a first step, not a final step or a side project, to truly improve the equitable impact of our work. So diving more into what it looks like to embed these in your practice, just some examples from the field. So intentionality, like we mentioned, recognizes the historical and social contexts in which we all exist, and also our identities and our cultures. And so as we work to embed intentionality in our work, it's important to ask ourselves, are the products that we're producing really fairly representing the audiences and their experiences, and are they being fairly included in our communication efforts? The image here on the left side of the slide is of the Do No Harm guide that was developed to improve the equity of the way we display our data. So the way we visualize it in terms of the terminology we use, but also in how we choose to use color, and then also the accessibility for people with different vision abilities. And I think it's a really great example of demonstrating how the way we visualize data can perpetuate or address the past inequities. So I really recommend taking a look at that guide. It's probably been updated since this screenshot that I chose. So apologies there. The next example or next key trait here is reflexivity. So this is asking, who are you in relation to the group that you're working to communicate with? And so some ways that we can put this into practice are asking questions of our audiences and remembering, that often said, I can't come up with the word for it, but we have 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason, kind of really practicing that, especially when we're working with marginalized communities. Beginning and ending our partner meetings with a reflection to understand how the process allowed people to share their perspectives or how we might need to evolve moving forward. To reflect on your biases as a team and also as an organization, to make sure that the team that's leading the project or originating the project that you're on, perhaps, or if you're on the receiving end, to make sure that your examples and the location of where you're meeting with folks is accessible. Looking to the right side of the screen, Monica Felio-Moher is a leader in this space, especially in the multilingual science communication world. So she's a Puerto Rican science communicator. And this quote here really focuses on how she felt like she wasn't represented in the way science was being communicated for her. She didn't see Puerto Ricans, she didn't see people who looked like her, who talked like her in the field. And so she really emphasizes the importance of culturally relevant examples. So reflecting on where are our examples coming from and do they mean anything to the people we're trying to communicate with. And related to that, the final recommendation here of embodying reflexivity is considering who on the team should be that point person for your partnership. Who will the community you're working with resonate with best? Focusing on multilingual science communication is another big piece of this, and there's been a lot of wonderful work exemplified here in this paper by Melissa Marquez and Ana Maria Porras. And then finally, reciprocity is our final key trait here. And this is the importance of ensuring that co-benefit and cultivating belonging and engagement for the audience and collaborator perspectives. This emphasizes the importance of earning trust with early engagement and follow through. So not just incorporating our communities at the end, recognizing the diverse ways of knowing, and focusing and seeing those as an asset, and recognizing them as equally valuable and valid. Ensuring you have some defined data ownership agreements so that there's shared ownership and belonging of the products and the process, and ensuring that you have continued relationships. So you're not just ending up doing an extractive one-off approach to your communication, and it's truly communication, not a unidirectional outreach approach. The image here is an example from the Hunatinglet tribe of Alaska, where they have a really deep, ancient sense of belonging in their homelands, but they were excluded from the decision-making about Glacier Bay National Park for a long time, and that bred a lot of trauma and distrust. The National Park Service has been working very hard at addressing this mistrust and building more collaborative relationships with the tribe over time, but there's still a lot of continued effort that must go into the really complex relationship between the tribe and the National Park Service. So that's one example of working towards the reciprocal benefit for both the tribe and the National Park Service. So looking at where this movement can go and continuing to create an impact-driven approach to our science and science communication, framing our work more holistically than just by our specific disciplines can help us to attract all interested parties and experts rather than reinforcing our silos. So this is recognizing that we might not all see ourselves as science communicators, but if you do science and you share the results in any way, or you're responsible for sharing results of science in any way, then you are communicating science and therefore a science communicator. And so that's a place that you can, that you belong, I guess, fundamentally. Really important to continue building networks and sharing resources to help unite this movement and really support our early career researchers and science communicators, because the early career folks, they really do start from a point of inclusion and from accessibility as default. So learning from their example. And then, of course, funding that focuses on the importance of this relationship building is another great way to promote this movement forward. pivoting to the other example of translational research in science, I'm going to start with some challenging jargon that took a long time for me to wrap my head around. So the difference between these two terms that seem very similar, translational research and translational science. For the purpose of this and based on past work, translational research is focused on specific research projects that are working with a specific final user to address a specific problem or challenge. So this is that probably what you would traditionally think of as like a research project. Translational science looks at more of the evaluation of how we studying how we do solutions-driven or translational research methods. This is work to make translational research more effective, and also the identification of the general principles that will hold across multiple translational research efforts. My team and I are continually trying to figure out the best way to visualize this relationship so it can stick in our minds. And this was the one that has been working for me lately. So thinking of our translational research as these distinct plants, they're all a little bit different and have their wonderful different traits, making different people happy and meeting different needs in different ways. And then thinking of translational science as the watering can or the fertilizer that improves the translational research or improves these plants' productivity and usefulness to, I guess, the gardener. So the translational science, again, is that evaluation or that synthesis and improvement of these distinct translational research projects. Now I'm going to zoom into how we do this kind of an approach at the Environmental Protection Agency. So at the EPA, the principles of translational research are that it takes a planned and methodical approach to stakeholder engagement throughout the entire research process. And rather than the priorities of the researchers driving the development of the research plan, it's the solutions we're trying to get to and the solutions-oriented outputs that drive the development of the research questions, methods, and implementation. And to the little graphic on the right, coordination, communication, and collaboration are the critical elements that help us to develop those integrated outputs that have a very multiplicative value to our partners throughout the project. And also importantly, translational research isn't over when the outputs are done. We then have to go and make sure that the solutions are being implemented with our stakeholders, and then we step back to that translational science perspective and evaluate, okay, well, how effective were these solutions that we've implemented for this community? The key steps that we take to implement translational research at EPA, we start with problem formulation, where we focus on the whole wicked problem, identifying who are all of the actors, what does success look like for this project, and identifies how ORD, that's our Office of Research and Development, where most of our more academic science is happening, identifies how the science contributions and coordination capacity can help us reach success as we've defined it with our partners. The science approach integrates the different disciplines that are involved to solve the problem. So what this means is that we don't have social science and biophysical science isolated answering their questions independently, but rather these different expertises are in conversation with each other all along the way to make sure that the questions the social scientists are asking are also of interest to the biophysical scientists and vice versa, and that their outcomes are supporting each other and our partners as much as possible. Also, the next important steps are that follow through to evaluate the effectiveness, so that stepping forward to translational science to see if the strategies we identified are successful, and then also asking, are they transferable? Are we able to take what we've learned here and take those approaches elsewhere? And if not, are there lessons we learned from this partnership that can play into the way we do partnership moving forward. And a big piece of being able to do that evaluation is documenting throughout the project how stakeholder engagement went throughout, and also improving the process of moving our science into practice. So the science of translational science, moving that from the translational science to the translational research. I know it's a jargony mess, but that's why I'm doing my best to make it clear, and we'll drive it home a little bit with these next 2 slides of examples. So these are 2 different translational research efforts seeking to address a couple big environmental challenges. So first, wildfire. So we had 2 big pilots that attempted to test out what this approach of translational research could look like at the Environmental Protection Agency. And the first addressed wildfire smoke exposure. And it had a number of key partners in Missoula, Montana, as well as in Hoopa, California. And then also now it's in a new stage. And the key questions they were trying to answer were around how effective air filtration systems are during smoke events, how effective portable air cleaners are in reducing PM 2.5 concentrations, and then what are some innovative approaches that can help reduce this smoke exposure. And in doing this, they had a variety of different projects that coexisted and integrated throughout. They did a really great job of that integrated approach. So they did their problem formulation through a web summit with their partners and their researchers to identify their shared goal and what they sought a solution for. And then they did field studies in Missoula and Hoopa alongside these laboratory studies to answer their questions, and then iterated on those. And that led to the development of a prize-based challenge to help improve the options and the knowledge available to address wildfire smoke. The second example is related to nutrient management on Cape Cod in Massachusetts. So here are the primary nutrients of concern are nitrogen and primarily in form of nitrates, and then also phosphorus. The key partners here were a nonprofit, a USGS, so the U.S. Geological Survey, and then the state level Environmental Protection Agency, as well as some other state and federal agencies. And they had their problem formulation process in person. That's what this top right picture is here, with people representing all those different entities, with a focus of reducing the coastal non-point sources of nutrients to the watershed on Cape Cod through some non-traditional approaches to nutrient management. And that integrated researcher expertise across the whole spectrum of very biophysical and not used to working with partners to our very applied social scientists, including myself. So I'm going to demonstrate kind of with the wrapping up here, or towards wrapping up here, what evaluating those 2 projects looked like as a translational science researcher. So the 2 questions I was asking was, what in learning about these 2 piloted efforts to learn about what it looks like to do translational research at a government agency, the 2 questions I wanted to learn really focused on engagement in this process, because that was the piece that seemed really new. So first of all, how do researchers and stakeholders or partners involved in translational research projects perceive engagement efforts? And then secondarily, what can we learn from those involved in these pilots about how to improve future translational research efforts? So what can be translated, transferred to future projects? And to do this, as a qualitative social scientist, I talked to people. So just as a timeline a little bit, as I was based primarily on the nutrients project, that's where this evaluation started. And so the problem formulation happened with that project back in 2018. The experiment began in 2019. I conducted project interviews all online with the new familiarity of Teams mid-2020 as we were getting the project off the ground. And we quickly identified some key findings from that, and then we immediately incorporated those into our research and our practice. And then in 2022, I conducted end of project interviews for that end of the pilot stage of this project. And then we thought, well, why wouldn't we learn across multiple projects? And so last year I did interviews with the team involved with the wildfire project as well, to see, even though we didn't have this mid-project point, were the lessons that they learned throughout their engagement process, and were their perceptions similar to those of the nutrient-focused project researchers. So looking first at findings from specifically the nutrients project across both that mid and end of project stage. Across the board, they emphasized the value and the wonderful collaboration experience they had. So the value of that collaboration and the importance of every single member of the team inside and outside EPA and inside and outside of our primary partner. They also emphasized the need for clarified expectations. This came from all of the actors. So I talked to both our team members at EPA and then also our partners outside of EPA across our different partner networks. And everyone kind of felt this sense of, we have a shared problem we're trying to address, but we're losing sight of what the end goal of this short-term project is. And whose role is what. So some need for clarified roles and responsibilities. And that existed mid and end of project. And then finally, repeatedly, as I'm sure many of you are aware of, the importance of recognizing it takes a lot of time to develop and maintain relationships that are inclusive and collaborative in a scientific research project. So taking the lessons we learned in 2020 and putting them immediately into practice while this project was still going on, primarily because the questions we asked were focused around engagement, adapted our engagement approach moving forward, recognizing that this also primarily happened during the deep days of the pandemic. Some of them were difficult to implement, but it became really clear that having our targeted communications for the different audiences, having information provided in various formats was really important. What people inside of EPA, leadership inside of EPA wanted was very different than what our partners on the ground wanted. Based on early findings in our interviews, we changed the way we communicated, really. So I worked alongside our partner and a bunch of researchers across the country who were in this working group on the scholarship and practice of engagement across, they called it working landscapes. So areas that are cultivated, it really was just partner-based research. How do we do that better? And a lot of academics and practitioners working together to figure out how we can do that better. We developed a newsletter that went out to anyone who was interested. This was kind of our broadest reach that went internally and externally, EPA and partners, just sharing research updates of where things were at. And we also included a researcher highlight or spotlight in each edition. This was biannual. That allowed us to kind of humanize the research a bit more, remind the people reviewing the newsletter that there are people behind EPA, and just kind of ground that a little bit. One thing we did at the beginning was use Twitter, which we quickly learned was not actually very effectively reaching our audience. And so that's something that we ended up stopping doing because it wasn't serving its intended purpose. But we also continued to amplify these more plain language versions of the social science and the biophysical science work we were doing in order to improve awareness of the projects. And then as we were able and as appropriate, we did try to increase our in-person visits because that was really something that for this community was very important to them. Looking across the two projects, these were the key findings that we found as we closed at the end of the pilot stage of the project, the key lessons that we learned about how we can improve translational research at EPA moving forward. And we're already seeing them implemented in a project going on in Canfield, Maryland, that's taking this translational approach. So first of all, the importance of an adaptive approach to research, allowing for research to adapt to changing problem definition and changing research needs so that the research ask, the ask of the researchers themselves can shift over time. The need to further define the roles and responsibilities of who's leading solutions-driven research, that's SDR, sorry about that, and make clear what the expectations are in case the leader of communications moves on to another role. Have a plan for the knowledge transfer. That's really important to keep continuity throughout the project of that lasting positive relationship. As always, funding is so important to these projects, and having the time to build the relationship requires money as well, and that this requires evolving funding needs that may not be predicted at the very beginning of the development of the relationship. And then also planning for the conclusion of the high intensity project. So having a well-bound research question and research commitment, so that not that their relationship ends, but their relationship evolves over time as the solutions are implemented, so that they can truly be tested by the partners rather than having the constant really high investment from the EPA researchers. So just very briefly, an example of something that we're doing right now is to look across the entire agency's translational science and research, the entire Office of Research and Development's translational science and research, to understand what have been the main achievements of our translational efforts to date. What can we see across all these projects of what's been successful and what we can adopt as lessons learned from what's been a little more challenging, and then provide some recommendations for how we can improve our translational science and translational research portfolio moving forward, recognizing that a lot of the work that is translational science or research might not be called that, because again, it's just a jargon soup sometimes. Again, this is just in progress, but I just wanted to give another example of a way to think about how we do science and how we can improve the impact of our science. So we're evaluating a bunch of documents of research products, is what we call them. So this is like research papers, presentations, fact sheets that researchers have produced starting in 2015, or I guess it's really end of 2014, that relate to engaged approaches to research. And we have a set of characteristics we're looking at, and then also doing a number of interviews with EPA staff and partners about what has gone really well in engaged research approaches and where might we improve. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip over the details of this analysis, but I'm happy to talk more about it if you're curious about methods. But we really hope to have from this resources for our researchers and scientists. So providing some more workshops and templates on what are the current best practices for taking a translational approach to research, provide a recommendation report to management of this is how we might better integrate translational research into our planning. And then because myself and my teammates, some of us are still very much required to produce scientific papers, and we want to share it with others in the community engaged research space, we will also likely produce a paper from it. And so, yeah, this has the potential to revise the way my team works and revision the way my team works. And so we're really excited about that. Just in brief conclusion, getting out of the weeds of how we do ask these questions and investigate these questions and moving back towards implementing translational science to our translational research or our science communication. I really want to drive home the importance of practicing transdisciplinarity in order to have truly impact-driven science. So this means looking beyond the discipline of your degree. I have very non-disciplined degrees. They don't environmental studies and marine affairs. So I already end up straddling a lot of disciplines, but I encourage everyone to do that. I am not a science communicator by academic training initially. I've found my way there through all of the literature and research and partnerships that I've been able to participate in. So I really encourage others to keep leaning into experimenting and partnering with people who have different expertise than yourself, to broaden and deepen your own expertise in these different ways of knowing and doing. build equitable collaborations across that entire spectrum from pure researcher to pure practitioner with everything in between as well. Recognize that there are a lot of different ways of knowing and communicating. So by intermodal, I mean, we can communicate with written word, with Zoom, with performance. There are many different ways that we can know and share our expertise. And also that these collaborations can exist in many ways with different levels of investment from everyone involved. And finally, that collaborative relationships will move at the speed of trust. So it's really important to invest that time initially and continually to have a trusting relationship in order to have a productive research experience and relational experience. Again, everyone has an important role to play in producing impactful research, and all forms of scientific research have significant value in producing a big impact. It's important to recognize the different roles that we all play in tackling these big environmental challenges we face today. I always want to remind everyone the importance of social scientists as well in asking these questions around all aspects of environment to help us ground in the fact that we as humans are, of course, also a piece of our environmental challenges and also are essential to the finding those solutions. And finally, can't go without saying that solutions and science are not going to have a very big impact if we're not successfully communicating them with the people that are affected and the people that can do something about it. So I encourage you all to help build up your confidence and practice in science communication, and I'm happy to help you do that and to answer any questions that you might have about what I talked about or otherwise.
Thank you, Kaytee. That was really great. I'm a little biased maybe as a science communicator myself, but I think it's important to have these discussions, at scientific conferences. So we have time for questions. You can either drop them in the Q&A in Zoom or in Whova itself. No, we've already got one.
Yep, I can go ahead and read that out, Sarah.
Okay.
Okay, so it says, thanks for this presentation, and it is great that the EPA is supportive of this approach. Do you have suggestions for how to communicate the importance of the time needed to build and maintain relationships with end users to administrators, deans, CEOs, reviewers of research proposals, etc., who may want this type of collaborative translational research to happen, but they expect the results on an unrealistic timeline or don't provide the funding and other resources to do the work well?
Yeah, absolutely. This is literally one of the questions that is my job to think about all of the time. And I agree, it's a big challenge. So I think there are a few different pieces of this. So one thing is recognizing or being able to provide, my brain isn't finding the right colloquialism for this, marking points, progress points along the spectrum. So it's not just the project is like done or not, but finding ways to break the project into smaller pieces that can demonstrate success, because so many of these problems require very long timescale solutions. So finding ways to break it into different stages of success. So having that first relational meeting, building that relationship as like a first, selecting your partner and defining the problem, that problem formulation, that's a first step towards success. And I think communicating to leadership, funders, what have you, that if you don't successfully build that relationship, you're not going to successfully produce usable research. I think that's really important. Something we've been thinking about and that I do think is being modeled at other funding agencies is, not that EPA is a funding agency specifically, but thinking about how there are increasingly grants that are focused on just that beginning stage of the process, or intentionally applying for that like project development grant to spend the whole whatever number of years it is to develop the relationship in and of itself and have that be the end goal of the grant. So there are increasingly options to do that. And something that an early leader, Rachel Burks, says is to researchize it. So finding ways to evaluate the process of building the relationship can help demonstrate that it is still science in and of itself to build these relationships and define these problems very intentionally. I agree that it can often feel like an uphill battle, but that's one method that we're thinking about is how we can have these different kinds of grants. And something we're trying to work towards is pitching those different kinds of grants to allow for extending the life cycle of a project to have that front end partnership and the back end evaluation as well. So some thoughts.
Just had another one. These Sea Grant folks have long questions.
Yeah, I can go ahead and read the next question. It says, thank you for your work, Kaytee. One of the engagement approaches you mentioned for your case study was around a frequent public bulletin with research updates. I'm curious how this might fit with topics that are more sensitive or rapidly evolving. For example, Southern California has an emerging DDT offshore contamination challenge, and our understanding is shifting so quickly in terms of where the DDT is and what its impact is. What is your perspective on the balance between getting information out quickly versus ensuring that misconceptions don't live on once those communications go online?
Great. This is another aspect. Some of my work's around harmful algal bloom, so not DDT, but similar with uncertainty and misconceptions. And that's absolutely a big challenge. I think that something that we've all learned a lot about in the last 5 years is the challenge of communicating that uncertainty with the pandemic and everything that went along with it. So I think that a bulletin might not be the best practice if you have something that's evolving super quickly. I think that it's important that I think it can be, though. I don't think there's one right answer. I think it can be successful as long as it's clearly communicated that this is the best information that we have right now. And I think that's something that's been recommended as best practice in science communication. Of course, we know storytelling is a best practice, but using the scientific method as a way to navigate that uncertainty and to tell our story with it, as like, again, putting the scientist into the story of like, this is where they're at in investigating this problem, and this is their certainty around it as they currently understand it. We're continuing to investigate it over time. And I think something else we've learned, and that the research backs up, is the importance of owning the uncertainty. And that's, I guess I've already kind of said that, but just stating that this uncertainty does exist. The best that we know right now is XYZ. And of course, that's around, I guess, uncertainty specifically. But with rapidly evolving things, I think that's the beauty of the internet. We can always provide updates as we get them. So if it's a bulletin that lives online, I think that would be a really great way to also demonstrate that story of the change of what we know over time. Kind of how, like, when there's a breaking news story, the New York Times, right? If you go down far enough, you might see inaccurate information if you read the breaking news from 2 hours ago compared to now. I think that can help us tell that story of how science is a process that improves itself over time. But I agree, again, lots of hard questions.
While we wait to see if there's any other questions, I actually have one. I'm curious about sort of the distinction between translational science and advising like EPA scientists on how to make their projects more inclusive and things like that, and sort of where that line is. I mean, I know you grow in and are a part of these research teams, and as a part of your research, you're kind of evaluating and helping them to shift it, right? Is that sort of the whole goal of the translational science team? Or would you say that you're also kind of doing some translational science for the sake of adding to the body of knowledge on translational science?
Absolutely. So in, of course, a confusing way, I've had multiple roles in the process of the story I told today, but the goal of our translational science team, as I see it, is to improve the experience of our researchers and our partners in doing engaged work to improve their own experiences of this process and make better outcomes for everyone. But yes, I am still like, my head's still in the academy a little bit. So I do think part of it is clarifying those best practices, but I like to think expansively about it and pretty much only produce papers when it really seems like the information is most useful to the audience of other social scientists, science communication researchers. And otherwise, I think that it really is my work product really has shifted from being academic papers to now, I just switched roles about 7 months ago, to now being more trainings, fact sheets, workshops for our researchers. Yeah.
So sort of an in-house consultation.
Exactly. Yeah.
That's great. Okay, great.
Sarah, we do have another question here. The next question is, how do you navigate discussions that involve significant obstacles like widespread environmental contaminants? It seems easy to overwhelm a layperson with the risk of disengaging them from the conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to default to my knowledge on climate change communication because it's similarly a very scary, big problem. And I've done a lot of digging around there. So there are some key practices there. It is a big, scary problem. And you're not supposed to like shy away from that reality. Again, like we do want to recognize that it is a scary problem. Some best practices that help, especially sometimes with microplastics, right? They're micro, we can't see them always. So making it less abstract. So providing concrete examples of consequences is a valuable way to help people relate to the challenge. Remembering that mental model piece is important as well, and demonstrating that real life, how it impacts them, but also examples that are relevant to their experience. Another piece of, if you're going to take the fear approach, it's really important to provide some sense of, provide responses people can take or actions people can take so that they have a sense of self-efficacy, that they can do something about it, and then also provide response efficacy, so evidence that their action does make a difference. So it's like the fear appeal model, if you want to Google it. But there's a lot of research on it, and it's explained in various levels of intensity. But that importance of, if you're going to take the fear appeal of this is the big scary thing, you pulling it down to this is related to you in this way. So the good example with climate change is polar bears. That's what we see visualized everywhere. But how many of you have seen a polar bear in real life, not in a zoo? So the idea of pulling it down to, like, if you're in an oceanfront community or a waterfront community, how climate change is going to affect water levels and things that will actually impact your real life. If you're going to make a fear appeal, that's what's going to relate most to people and make them feel motivated to do something about it. And then also recognizing that with those different mental models we have different willingness to adopt that scientific information, especially in very politicized environments and politicized topics. And so recognizing that if someone is in strong disagreement with you, the likelihood of them being a strong advocate by the end of your conversation is not high, and that's okay. And that moving that needle, right, if we think of it as like a speedometer, any bit is a success. So again, it's that like breaking into the progress points and finding ways to relate to the different audiences you're working with.
And Sarah, we do have one last question. Do we have time for that one?
We can take one last question, and then I think we're going to be right at time. So that's perfect.
Okay, great. So the last question is regarding how to implement a move toward more asset-focused versus deficits in public engagement. Any comments on whether or how to move away from a needs assessment?
Yeah, that's a great question, and not actually something I've actively thought about, but I guess I'm just thinking about how fundamentally, I think it's in how we're framing it, because we still want to be supporting communities and different partners who have been marginalized or do have true needs, right? Like the EPA right now, since that's what I'm most familiar with, is very focused on environmental justice work. But I think that in taking this angle of, we call it solutions-driven research, or like problem formulation, I think you can identify like environmental challenges. I think that that really, to me, is a semantics game. And I don't think that it's something worth completely moving away from. I think that there are more inclusive and equitable ways to go about assessing needs. And I think that that comes into who is on the team of designing the assessment itself. So I think, yes, the semantics of calling it a needs assessment, we could absolutely revise, but I think making sure that you're truly designing that assessment process with a partner that would benefit from the partnership is a key step in moving away from an extractive or a deficit-based approach to those assessments.
Great, thank you. Great questions. And so thank you, Dr. Canfield, for your time. That was a really, really great presentation.